We are engaged, as Abraham Lincoln said, in a great civil war. And all of the different people from all different nations, the keepers from Africa, from Asia, from Australia, from Latin America, and the United States, and from Europe, are all involved in the same kind of battle. And it's a battle that is not just about protecting the waterways in our backyard. It's about protecting, it's about justice, it's about fending off oppression, it's about trying to create an economic system that is fair, that is based on justice. It's about humanity, and it's about all of the things that we value as a people. And Bernice spoke here 2 days ago, and she told a story about the thing that inspired her as an environmentalist, which was a sewage treatment plant called the North River Sewage Treatment Plant that was put up on 170th Street in Harlem and ruined a middle-class black community in Harlem for many years. And we were deeply involved in Riverkeeper in that battle. But one of the things, and Bernice said that it began construction in 1968, which was the year that my father was killed. What she didn't tell you was that the park, the 130-acre park, and what she probably didn't know, that was put on that facility was put there because of my father. The person who built that facility there was Robert Moses, who was a great political rival of my father. And originally that plant was supposed to have been built at the 79th Street Boat Basin, which was the logical place for that plant because that's where the old topography, the river ended. And that plant made sense there because you didn't need pumps. But that was a white community. And so it got kicked uptown and kicked uptown and kicked uptown again and again till it landed in a community that couldn't defend itself. And that's what environmental justice is about. It's about these obnoxious, about NIMBY, which is a good thing. All of us defending our own backyard, that's the whole theme of our movement. We defend our rivers, but what it also means is that the obnoxious facilities flow to the communities that cannot protect themselves. So they end up, so that's why 4 out of every 5 toxic waste dumps in America is in a black neighborhood. The largest toxic waste dump in America is at Mele, Alabama, which is 85% black. The highest concentration of toxic waste dumps in America is the south side of Chicago. The most contaminated zip code in California is East LA. These are black and Hispanic communities. Navajo youth, we have Hopi here from the Black Mesa Trust. Navajo youth have hundreds of times the level of sexual organ cancer as other Americans because of the thousands of tons of toxic uranium tailings that have been dumped on their reservation lands. My original battles as my first lawsuit as an environmental attorney was representing Riverkeeper and the NAACP to stop a road that was going to be built through the oldest black community in New York. And after that, one after the other, we saw racial implications in every battle that we took on. One of the first battles that we fought was about the water supply in New York. There's 3 water systems in New York, and one of the reservoir systems is the dirtiest. It's called the Croton system. It has 102 sewage treatment plants into it. The water coming out of that system is 3% sewage. It goes unfiltered to New York. We wanted to know what communities that water was going to. So we sued the city of New York for the distribution maps, and they wouldn't give it to us. Finally, they gave it to us literally on the steps of the courthouse. And what we found was that that water was being directed to the poorest communities in New York, to Harlem, the South Bronx, the Lower East Side, and Hell's Kitchen, all of them black communities. In fact, there were the parts of those maps that were shaded dark were the areas where the bad Croton water was going. And coming down the Upper East Side of Manhattan through Harlem, we saw a little tiny white dot in one of those communities that was getting, it was the only home in the entire community that was getting Delaware River water. And we had to get out a magnifying glass and look at it, and it was the mayor's house, Gracie Mansion. But all the water around that house, which was a black community, was getting the dirty water from the Croton system. In 1989, we sued Westchester County because they closed most of their parks for budgetary reasons. That's what they said. But as it turns out, the only parks that actually closed were the parks that were near train stations where people, black people and Hispanics, could come up from the Bronx to be on the Hudson River or to be on Long Island Sound. And they left the golf courses, which were biggest money drainers, open. We sued them under the public trust doctrine, and we won that case. This is not a United States phenomena. In every one of your countries, for those of you who come from other places in the world, the same thing is happening. It's going to be the defenseless people who are not getting their rights. Joseph Darville, who's here from the Bahamas, the first case that we did down in the Bahamas was a case to stop a hotel from taking control of the last major beach near Nassau. If you look throughout the Caribbean, all of the beaches now are fenced off from the people who live on those islands. And those people are confined to the sweltering center of the islands, while the beaches are owned by multinational corporations. The Riverkeeper, Robinson, and the other people who are here from there, every single river in Chile is now owned by a Spanish company, and they have plans to dam every single one of them. So the people of the nation no longer own the rivers, they don't own the forests, they don't own the commons of their land. The most important civil rights leader, human rights lawyer in Chile said, supposedly we have a democracy after Pinochet left. But we don't have a democracy because we have no control over the sovereignty of our resources. We have no control over the sovereignty of our lands. And this is what the battle is about. It's about who's going to control the commons, the air, the water, the wildlife, the fisheries, the shared resource of our society. And the primary role of a democracy, of government in a democracy, is to safeguard the commons, to make sure that those assets stay in the hands of the people, whether they're rich or poor, black or white, humble or noble, that everybody has a right to use those things. Nobody has a right to use them in a way that will diminish or injure their use and enjoyment by others. And though most of you know this, that law is called the public trust doctrine. It comes to us from ancient Rome. It was in the Code of Justinian. It was in the Magna Carta. And what it says is that things that belong to all the people, that by their nature cannot be reduced to private property, but are owned by all of the people, that those things, and I'll tell you this for those of you who don't know it. In ancient Rome, the Code of Justinian said that the things that the beaches, the waterways, the fisheries, the wildlife, the public lands, that they belong to the people. If you were a citizen of Rome, you had an absolute right to cross a beach, throw in a net, and take out your share of the fish. The emperor himself couldn't stop you because these were part of the commons. But when Roman law broke down in Europe during the Dark Ages, beginning in 390 AD, the same thing happened. The first sign of a tyranny are efforts by powerful entities within a society to privatize the public trust assets. And that's what happened all across Europe. In England, King John said the deer, which were a social safety net for the poor, which belonged to all the people, could no longer be hunted by the poor. He erected navigational tolls on the Thames and the rivers of England so that what was once free, what was once a critical social safety net for everybody in the country, could only be used now if you paid a wealthy friend of the king's. He gave monopolies to the fisheries to his friends. So the fish, if you lost your job, you could have gone into the woods, shot a deer, taken out a fish. You could no longer do that. Those things were robbed from the people. And that's what caused Robin Hood to rise up. The barons rose up, confronted him. They forced King John to sign the Magna Carta, and that was the beginning of constitutional democracy on our planet. And when we had the revolution in our country, those rights descended to the people of our states. But they were gradually taken away from us by the power of industries and monopolies who stole them from the American people. And then in 1970, 20 million Americans came out onto the street, and I remember what it was like before Earth Day 1970. I remember the Cuyahoga River burning with flames that were 8 stories high that nobody could put out. I remember in 1969, the Santa Barbara oil spill that closed all the beaches in Southern California and cost billions of dollars to those communities and kept people away from their waterways. I remember that Lake Erie was declared dead, that I couldn't swim in the Hudson, the Charles, the Potomac when I was growing up. I remember when the eastern peregrine falcon, the most beautiful predatory bird that we have in North America, went extinct in 1963, the same year that my uncle was killed. And all of those insults in 1970 drove 20 million Americans out onto the street, 10% of our population, demanding that our political leaders return to the American people the ancient environmental rights that had been stolen from our citizens over the previous 80 years. And the political system, because they were frightened of democracy, because they were scared of this huge public outpouring, responded. Republicans and Democrats got together, and over the next 10 years, we passed 28 major environmental statutes: the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, RCRA, the Endangered Species Act, Superfund, the Safe Drinking Water Act. All of these actions which were intended to restore our rights to the public commons. But what happened then? Industry fought back in many, many different ways, and most of us have been fighting them for years. But their big victory came when they appointed their own Supreme Court. When the Bush administration appointed 5 members of the Supreme Court, and my partner, Carl Copeland, is here, who is a Supreme Court scholar. He was the law clerk to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And what he says about the Supreme Court is there is no coherent conservative philosophy. The only coherent thing that these 5 members have is that the corporations always win. If it's an individual against the corporation wins. If it's government against the individual, government wins. But if it's government against the corporation wins. You can look at all of their cases, they all end the same way. They're very, very predictable. And one of the worst things they did is that the 5 of them took the 2000 election and they turned it over to an oil man. They stopped the count in Florida illegally. Sandra Day O'Connor now says, who was one of the justices who voted to stop that count, we were going to elect the biggest environmentalist in our history, Al Gore. He got elected president. But they took it away from him by stopping the count in Florida, and George Bush came in, and 17 of the top 21 people in his administration were oil men or oil women. His Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, was on the board of Chevron and has a Chevron tanker named after her. And what did he do? He called all of his oil buddies in, Dick Cheney, for 90 days. They met in secret. We don't even know who was in there. But we know that they rewrote environmental law, and they rewrote the Safe Drinking Water Act to legalize an obscure process by the Halliburton Company called fracking. And that's where it came from. But all of our laws were rewritten at that time to make it easy to drill, to burn, to extract, to ship, to distribute carbon fuel. It was a victory for the carbon industry. And then that same Supreme Court in 2010 did something even worse. They passed the Citizen United case, which turned our American democracy over to the large corporations. And today, it's hard to argue that we still have a democracy in this country. When you have the Koch brothers, the 2 richest people in America, in the world, when you put their fortunes together, who have pledged already, just at the beginning, to put $900 million into this presidential election. 2 elections ago, each party, the total amount spent was $1 billion per party. The election before that, $1 billion altogether. This year, it's going to be $10 billion. And $1 billion is going to come from 2 brothers. That's the same amount of money that is being put into this election by the Democratic Party. The same amount of money that's being put in by the Republican Party. So what happens to our politics when money runs our political system? And we know this. We know from looking at data over the past 20 years that in 96% of the elections, the candidate with the most money won the election. So you can buy elections in this country. Now, do you think that Charles and David Koch are putting $900 million into this election because they love America? Do you think that they are putting $900 million into the election because they love humanity? Do you think that they're putting $900 million in because of a patriotic impulse? No. Do you think they have a moral compass? No, they have a moral compass, and it's pointed at H, which means hell. And that's where they're going to bring all of us if we let them. These are the forces, these are the apocalyptical forces of ignorance and greed. Like Tim DeChristopher said, these are evil people. These are people who are going to bring us all up to perdition, who are going to end civilization, who are going to kill millions, hundreds of millions, billions of people so that they can stuff their pockets. And we are in a revolution today. All of us. We are the soldiers in a war against carbon. And this is an industry that no longer has a justifiable economic model. They cannot justify themselves in any model of free market capitalism. And I started working out my career, and to this day, I still represent commercial fishermen on the Hudson. We have the oldest commercial fishery in North America. It's 350 years old. It's a sustainable fishery. They were unregulated. They regulated themselves. You know how they did it? They counted the fish as they came into the first set of nets. Each one of them had a stretch going up. They still do today. The Ingold family, the Gabrielson family, the DeGroots, all the way up the river. Every stretch of the river was owned traditionally by families that have been fishing that stretch of the river for 3 centuries. And when they counted the fish as they hit the shad, as they hit that first net, they made a decision among themselves: we are going to pull our net. If they had plenty of fish in, they'd leave their nets 6 days a week. If they had fewer fish, they'd pull their nets out and let the fish through 2 days a week or 3 days a week, whatever they needed. But they did it themselves. It was a sustainable fishery. It would have lasted forever. They had a business model that worked. There was nothing wrong with their business model. Why are they out of work today? They wanted their children fishing that river, but their kids can't fish that river. Their kids are hanging sheetrock and they're laying asphalt. Why are they doing that? Not because the business model was failing. They're doing that because the General Electric Company had more clout in Albany than they did. And the General Electric Company was able to use its political clout to cheat the free market, to organize market failure, to dump their toxins into the river and privatize the fish in the Hudson River. So the Constitution of the state of New York says that the people of the state own the waterways of the state, and we own the fish in the Hudson. Well, we don't own them anymore. The General Electric Company owns every fish in the river, because they privatized them. They put their toxics in them, and they pocketed the profits. They turned them into profits. And the coal industry throughout this country has done the same thing. They have privatized every freshwater fish in America by putting their toxic mercury in every freshwater fish. So people talk about privatization and they say, okay, Bechtel started a war in Bolivia by privatizing the water supply. But it's not just happening in Bolivia. And the big multinationals started a war in Syria by privatizing the water supply and driving 1 million farmers off their land. But it's not just happening in Syria. It's happening everywhere, and it's happening in this state, and it's happening all over the country. And it's happening all over the world. And if they can't outright own that river, they can pollute it so nobody else can use it but them. And that's the same thing as privatizing it. And we are all at war with these corporations, because when they take that away from us, they are not just taking the waterway. They're not just taking a recreational facility or a food supply or a working or a job. They're taking our democracy. They're stealing our values. They're stealing our culture. They're stealing our heritage. They are creating a colonial economy. And that's what all of this is about. It's about creating a colonial economy. And when I was a little boy, I used to go to Latin America, and I looked at what happened when they started a colonial economy in those nations. We owned all of the copper. We owned all of the fruit, United Fruit Company, Anaconda Wire and Cable. We owned all of the oil, our corporations. And what happened locally? In order to steal the resources from those countries, we couldn't allow a democracy because populism and democracy is not a good vessel for the control of a country by billionaires. They won't do it. So they came into those countries, they subjugated the people, they extracted the metals, they made themselves billionaires, they paid off the local oligarchs, they paid off the military to protect their interests, and then they left those countries impoverished and with authoritarian rule. And that's what happens. The reason you see this huge split now between the Democratic and Republican Party in this country is the same way you do in every colonial model. Because the colonial model creates a wealthy class and a poor class, and it eliminates the middle class. And when you have a wealthy class and a poor class and no middle class, the role of one political party becomes to protect the perks and power of the wealthy class. They can't do it through populism because nobody's going to vote that those guys get to continue to be billionaires forever. So they have to control the military, they control the vote, they make sure people don't get to vote who would vote against them, and they lie, and they control it through propaganda. And that's the devolution that you're seeing today in the United States of America. We have allowed this country, because of the Citizens United case and because of the takeover of corporations that it has spawned, we have turned this country into a colonial economy. Now, we sued Smithfield Food for the past 20 years. Guess what? Smithfield Food is now owned by the Chinese. God bless the Chinese who are here. It's not good for America when 85% of our pork production is owned by a foreign power. Do you think that they care in Shanghai about the air that farmers are breathing in North Carolina? Do you think they care about 1 billion dead fish in the Neuse River? Do you think they even know about it? Of course they don't. That's what happens when you allow a colonial economy. And that's not just happening in the food industry. It's happening with carbon. And again, we have a model that works. I wrote an article a year ago with David Crane, who is the CEO of NRG, which is the biggest energy producer in the United States, in North America. And David Crane has coal plants, he has gas plants, he has nuke plants, he has wind, he has solar, he has bunker C oil plants, diesel plants. So he's agnostic about what kind of energy he uses. But what he said in this article that we did for the New York Times is that in 25 states, that today, even when natural gas was at $2, today it's at $4.60, 1,000 cubic feet. Even when it was at historic lows, unsustainable at $2, he said, if I had $100 million to spend on a new power plant, I would not build a gas plant, I would not build a coal plant, I would not build an oil plant, I would build a solar plant. Because solar energy is the cheapest form of energy. So the Koch brothers know this. They can't compete against us in a fair market, so they need subsidies. And the World Bank announced last week that we today globally are giving $5 trillion in subsidies to the carbon industry every year. we're giving $1 trillion in this country in subsidies to the richest industry in the history of the planet. Why would we do that? The only reason we do that is because the Kochs own our government. There's no economic reason to do that. They don't have an economic model that works. So what are they doing? What do you do when you don't have an economic model that works? You use your money to use our campaign finance system, which is a system of legalized bribery, to get your hooks into a public official and then allow you to privatize the commons and to dismantle the marketplace and give you a competitive edge and monopoly control. And so you have the Kochs who are, have their front organization, ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, in every state, working with local legislatures and bribing them and blackmailing them to get rid of the supports for wind and solar. And you know what else they're doing? They're getting all these subsidies for themselves to balance the free market against them. And the biggest thing that they're doing is that they've changed the laws on Capitol Hill to make it very easy to build a pipeline in this country and almost impossible to build a transmission line. Why? Because we use transmission. Wind and solar needs transmission, and they use pipeline. So we built in the last 12 years in this country 16,000 miles of pipeline and only 600 miles of transmission line. And why are they building pipelines down the Hudson River that we have to fight, down the Columbia River, down the Rogue River, across North America from the tar sand? Why do you think the Kochs are giving $900 million to the political process? Here's one answer. Because they own $65 billion of tar sands oil in northern Alberta. So if they can get a pipeline built, they can get that oil to market in Asia. It's not going to help the United States. It's going to drive up the price of gas in the United States. There's nothing good. It's going to create, according to their own estimates, 35 jobs. They're building a 2,000-mile pipeline, and guess what? This is such an important thing to our country. The Congress that they elected said, John Boehner said that this was the #1 priority of the Republican Party, to get that pipeline built. It's the first thing they acted on, and that's what they're doing. And why are they doing it? Not just so that they can dominate the oil space, but to harden their infrastructure, to get everybody, all the other wealthy interests in this country invested in those pipelines. When they build a pipeline, who's financing it? Or when they build an LNG facility or a coal port, who's financing it? It's Goldman Sachs, and it's JP Morgan, and it's the pension funds, and it's the sovereign wealth funds. So now you have all these very wealthy interests in the nation who have and they get 30-year contracts. So these wealthy interests now have a vested interest in making sure there's oil running through those pipes and gas running through those pipes for the next 30 years. And it's nothing to do with something that's good for our country. I'll tell you what's good for our country: $4.60 gas, right? You know what they're paying in Asia? I'll tell you why it's good. You know what they're paying in Asia for gas? $17. So you know what that's done to our country? It's created a manufacturing renaissance in our country. In 2 years, because of cheap energy, there have been 200,000 jobs, really good manufacturing jobs. So I'm going to tell you guys this, that DuPont and Dow Chemical came to us, to Waterkeeper, to me, and said, we want to give you a lot of money to fight LNG facilities because we don't want the gas going to Asia. Why? Because if you look at the EIS that Brett Vanden Heuvel is fighting, the EIS by the gas company, what it says is we want to create an equilibrium with Asia. So that would take away all of this new manufacturing capacity, and guess what else it would do? It would make sure that every bit of shale in this country had a pipe going into it. We wouldn't be able to turn them back in New York. We wouldn't be able to turn them back anywhere else. All of it would be exploited if it was worth $17 a 1,000 cubic feet. So, and it would rob us of the jobs that are now being created by Dow and DuPont. You know, methane is the feedstock for these chemical industries, and it is we now can compete around with low labor markets around the world because we have cheap energy in this country. So I'm not saying that's a good thing, but it's a good thing for America, and it makes no sense that any American politician would want to see an LNG facility built to transform Canadian millionaires into Canadian billionaires and to enrich utility owners in Asia and into China. It doesn't do anything for our country except for pollute us. But they're doing it because they own the political process, and they're hardening that infrastructure so that we will be locked into their archaic, antiquated, miserable form of power 30, 40, 50 years after any economic rationale for it is gone. They wrote the rules, the incumbents, the carbon incumbents, wrote the rules that govern and regulate energy distribution in this country. These are rules that favor the poisonous, destructive, addictive, miserable fuels from hell rather than the cheap, clean, green, wholesome, and patriotic fuels from heaven. And we need to turn that around. And you know, you can build today in this country, you can build a solar power plant for $2.6 billion a gigawatt. The cost of building a coal plant is $3 billion a gigawatt. The cost of building an oil plant, $3 billion a gigawatt. The cost of building a nuke plant, $15 billion a gigawatt. Why would you do it? We could make energy by burning prime rib if we wanted. Why in the world would you build a nuclear power plant? It costs 5 times as much, and then you have to dispose of the waste for the next 30,000 years, which is 5 times the length of recorded human history. It makes no sense except to an insane person. But it makes sense to the insane people who are governing these countries, who are just indentured servants for the incumbents, the energy incumbents, and sock puppets for the energy incumbents in this country. And what they're doing is irrational, it's destructive. And once you build that plant, once you build our plant, that solar plant, now you got free energy forever because the photons are hitting the earth every day for free. All we have to do is build the infrastructure to harvest them and put them in the line. Once you build the oil plant, once you build the coal plant, now you got to go cut down the Appalachian Mountains, ship them across the country in rail yards, warp the rails, pulverize the roads, burn the coal, poison every fish in America, kill 20,000 people a year from ozone and particulates, acidify the Appalachians, poison every lake in the Adirondacks, and that's just part of the cost. And it just begins once you build that plant. Once you build an oil plant, now you got to go to Saudi Arabia, punch holes in the ground, bring up the oil, refine it expensively, genuflect to the sheiks who despise democracy, who are hated by their own people, and who won't let women drive a car without putting her in jail. And then you have to go to periodic wars, which cost $4.3 trillion. That's what the last one cost. And they have to escort the oil across the Atlantic, which, with a military escort that, guess what? Exxon doesn't pay for it. You and I do. And you spill it all over the Gulf, spill it all over Valdez, burn the oil, and poison everybody in the country. How does it make sense economically? This isn't free market capitalism. These people hate free market capitalism. They hate free market capitalism. And I'm all for corporations. I like corporations. They encourage people to accumulate wealth and assemble it and risk it and create jobs. But they should not be running our government because they don't want the same thing for our country as Americans want or Colombians want or Mexicans want. They don't want democracy. They don't want clean air. They want profits, and they want no competition. And they will spend, the Pew Foundation did a study about what the biggest return on investment is in this country today. And you know what it is? They looked at the wool industry, the paper industry. They looked at the energy sector, they looked at the agricultural sector, every sector. You know what the #1 return is? Investing in politics, giving a contribution to a politician. That's where you get the biggest return on investment. So they are totally corrupting our democracy. They're stealing everything that we care about in this country. And we are here to fight them. And that's what we do. And we understand what they're doing, and we have to tell each other about it and explain it, and we have to go out because they own the media too. We have to go out and we have to fight them, and we have to fight them on the ground, and we have to fight them in our communities, and we have to fight them with the grassroots. And that's what we do. We are warriors, and like Tim said, today we killed the TPP. That was a victory for our side. And there's many, many victories that they say that we can never have, that we're too powerless. But when we get together, we're very, very powerful, and we can beat them. But we have to do that. We have to stay together, and we have to talk to each other and communicate to each other. And we have to treat people who live in other countries as brothers, because we're all fighting the same thing. And I'm all for, and I've said to you, many times, we're not protecting I'm all for free market capitalism. I believe in a true free market. You can't make yourself rich without making your neighbors rich and without enriching your community. What polluters do is they make themselves rich by making everybody else poor. They raise standards of living for themselves by lowering quality of life for everybody else. And they do that by escaping the discipline of the free market. You show me a polluter, and I'll show you a fat cat using political clout. A fat cat using political clout to escape the discipline of the free market and force the public to pay his production costs. That's what all pollution is. All pollution, that's what it is. If you're truly free market capitalism, every actor in that system should pay the true cost of bringing his product to market. And that includes the cost of cleaning up after yourself, which was a lesson we were all supposed to have learned in kindergarten. But they buy the politicians so they don't have to do that, and they can externalize their costs. They can put their poisons in the air and put it in our waterways, and they can poison our children and create deformities and cancers, and they can externalize their costs and artificially lower the price of their products so that they can beat a clean product that in a true market would prevail in the marketplace. And what all the environmental laws, the 28 laws that we passed after Earth Day 1970, all of those laws are intended to restore true free market capitalism by forcing actors in the marketplace to pay the true cost of bringing their product to market. And what we do in the Waterkeeper movement is we're not only environmentalists, we're free marketeers. We go out into the marketplace and we catch the cheaters, the polluters, and we say to them, we are going to force you to internalize your costs the same way that you internalize your profits. Because as long as somebody is cheating the marketplace, none of us gets the advantages of the efficiency and the prosperity and the democracy that free market capitalism otherwise promises our nation. And what we have to understand is that there's a huge difference between true free market capitalism, and which makes a nation more efficient, more prosperous, and more democratic, and the kind of corporate crony capitalism which we have now in this country, which is antithetical to efficiency, prosperity, and democracy in America as it is in Nigeria. And throughout our nation's history, you hear these Tea Party people, who are funded by the Koch brothers, saying, well, the big enemy is big government. Of course they don't like government because government counterbalances corporate power. But if you look throughout American history, and I believe government is dangerous to democracy. When government is shooting people with drones and torturing people and spying on every American and suspending habeas corpus, it is dangerous to democracy. But that's not what they're worried about. They just don't want to pay their taxes, and they want to pollute. They don't care about all that other stuff about big government. They just don't want to pay taxes. So from the beginning of our nation's history, our most important visionary political leaders have warned the Americans that the bigger enemy to democracy is big corporate power. And Republicans and Democratic. Teddy Roosevelt said that American democracy would never be destroyed by a foreign enemy. But he warned that our beloved democratic institutions would be subverted by malefactors of great wealth who would steal them from within. Dwight Eisenhower, in his most famous speech ever, warned Americans against the domination by the military-industrial complex, which is exactly what we've got today. Abraham Lincoln, the greatest Republican in our history, the founder of the Republican Party, said in 1863, at the height of the Civil War, I have the South in front of me, and I have the bankers behind me. And for my nation, I fear the bankers more. And Franklin Roosevelt, during World War II, said that the domination of government by corporate power is, quote, the essence of fascism. And Benito Mussolini, who had an insider's view of that process, said the same thing. He said he complained that fascism should not be called fascism. It should be called corporatism, because he said it was the merger of state and corporate power, which he looked upon as a good thing. And all around the world, whether it's China or Latin America or the United States, you're seeing that evil combination of corporate and government merger. And you know, in the U.S., we're seeing it with the Koch brothers. In China, they went straight from communism to fascism, where, you know, the same thing. And all over the world, we're seeing this exact same thing. And that is the thing that we all have to battle. This takeover of our nation, our rights, our sovereignty. What colonialism does to us is it subjugates the people, it commoditizes the animals, it commoditizes the landscapes, and it extracts the wealth, and it destroys everything that we value. And it's our duty to fight those things. And we're not protecting the environment so much, which I learned from the fishermen very early on, for the sake of the fishes and the birds. We're protecting it for our own sake, because we recognize that nature is the infrastructure of our communities. And that if we want to meet our obligation as a generation, as a nation, as a civilization, which is to create communities for our children that provide them with the same opportunities for dignity and enrichment and prosperity and good health as the communities that our parents gave us, we've got to start by protecting our environmental infrastructure, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the wildlife, the fisheries, the public lands, the aquifers, those things that belong to all of us, that are part of the commons, the landscapes and rivers that connect us to our past, to our history, that provide context to our communities, and that are the source ultimately of our values and our virtues and our character as a people. And this is in the United States, it's in Canada, it's in Mexico, it's in all the nations of Latin America, it's in Senegal, it's in all across Africa, Australia, Asia, Europe. The same battles are being fought. And this organization is now the largest water protection group in the world. It occurred to me today that, you know, I started out with NRDC. We are now bigger than NRDC. We're going to be the biggest environmental group in the world pretty soon. And, you know, Tim DeChristopher is a genuine environmental hero. He took individual action. He went up against the most powerful industry in the West. He did it with ingenuity, and he completely screwed them up. And then he went to jail for it. And we have to be willing to do that stuff. You know, all of us, and I know every one of you, and I said to Tim, every single person here puts principles before anything else. Every single person here is willing to die with their boots on. We got a lot. The reason we got so many old river keepers here and water keepers here is because these are people, and the reason so many people put tattoos on their body, because these are people who have said, we're going to make the commitment. This is what we're giving our lives to. We are going to do whatever we need to do in obscurity or in fame, in wealth or in poverty. Wherever you find us, we are going to be fighting for these values, for these rights, for these rivers, and for all the values that we care for as a people and as humanity. Thank you very much.